Yeah, laser's working. Okay, I wanted to talk about the possibility of a referendum on the question of equalization. So this is a quite narrow presentation. I just want to get into the nuts and bolts of referendum on equalization. This doesn't apply to other kinds of topics. Those have to be discussed on their own merits. Okay, can you advance it now?
Let's switch mics.
Okay.
Making a bad noise.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. So before I delve into that, can you advance it? And I'll just a moment of shameless self-promotion here. Mention most recent book edited along with Jack Vince and Ted Morton called Moment of Truth. And it has about a dozen essays on different aspects of where Alberta is now in relation to Confederation, what it's suffered in the past, what could be done about it, different options. You can buy the paperback, or there's an ebook version. I think it's only $11. I mean, it's so cheap that, as our finance minister has said, you can't afford not to buy it. You have to have it. Anyway, I had hoped to have some copies here for sale, but it didn't work out for some reason with the publisher. But you could just go online to Amazon and order it immediately. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, too far. Okay, just some information about equalization. The program exists as a result of federal legislation, which was first passed in 1957, and there have been many changes since then. Many of the changes are just through order in council. Cabinet has wide discretion to change the equalization formula. It was entrenched in the Constitution in 1982, but in a vague way. The Section 36 doesn't say anything about the size of equalization payments. However, it does set up criteria for what equalization ought to accomplish. Personally, I think that Section 36 could be used as a judicial challenge to the current equalization program, because it doesn't live up to the criteria that are enumerated in Section 36. Saskatchewan considered this at one time, but didn't carry it through. This, however, is a different topic from a referendum, and so I just mentioned that in passing. It would require a different analysis. Okay, can we move on? Okay, here's some information about equalization. This is kind of hard to read for me. Oh, that's even worse. My 77-year-old eyes aren't doing it. Okay, yeah, that's great. Make it a bit larger. This is how the payments were distributed in fiscal 2018-19. Just focus on the final payment over that column on the right, and that tells you how much. I'm going to have to move with the mic to do this. I've got to get closer to the table. I don't know how to. Yeah, okay. 77-year-old eyes aren't quite cutting it this morning. So, of the equalization payments, Quebec got almost $12 billion. $11,732 million. So Quebec is far and away the biggest beneficiary of this. Some other provinces got something. Because of the expansion here, we can't identify it. Yeah, there we go. So great. Newfoundland got nothing. PEI got $419 million. Nova Scotia got almost $2 billion. New Brunswick got almost $2 billion. Quebec, as I said, got almost $12 billion. Ontario interestingly, got to almost $1 billion, and Manitoba got a little over $2 billion, and then Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC got nothing. So the way this works is that the money is collected in the form of federal taxation. So there's not a levy on Alberta as such. The government of Alberta doesn't pay anything. Taxpayers in Alberta contribute along with taxpayers in the rest of the country. So, but we don't get anything back in payments, and we haven't gotten anything back. Here's a further analysis of it. In the table that you looked at, the total payments were $18.96 billion that year. Now, Alberta taxpayers contribute 18% of federal tax revenues. That's in the past they have. I think that's going to go down, but in the past, through a combination of corporate tax, personal income tax, GST revenues, and other kinds of federal taxes that are not as well known, Alberta makes up about 11% of the population of Canada, but contributes about 18% of total revenue. So that means that in that year we contributed $3.41 billion of the equalization total. And if you want to look at what went to Quebec, we contributed to about $2.1 billion to Quebec. So it's like Alberta taxpayers as individuals gifted Quebec $2.1 billion. Going forward to the current fiscal year, we're almost at the end of it. Total payments are expected to be 20.3. Alberta taxpayers will contribute 3.7 billion of that. Quebec will receive 13.3 billion, and that means that we are gifting Quebec 2.4 billion. So it's a lot of money. Let's look at the next slide. Now, here's something that you have to keep in mind. Because of economic conditions in Alberta, which have really slumped after 2014-15, the fiscal year, you see there's, we had a big year previously, but it stayed more or less pretty high. This is, excuse me, I should mention, this figure along this axis is what they call fiscal capacity. That's how equalization is calculated. And I'm not going to go into the details of it. There's only a few people in Canada who actually understand all of it. But it's a combination of how much you could raise through taxation, plus 50% of non-renewable resource revenue. So it's oil, gas, royalties, leases, things like that. So this is per capita fiscal capacity. It remained high up until right here is fiscal 2014-15, 2015-16. It starts to slide, and it's forecast. The last couple of years are forecasted. Numbers are always behind.
Yes. There you go. For some reason, we have to switch these batteries, but you can hold that button until it turns red.
Yeah, okay. Okay, great. So we're back with the microphone. So what's happening is that Alberta's fiscal capacity is converging, according to prediction, with that of the average of Canada in general. Fraser Institute published, I got this from a Fraser Institute paper, they call it the Great Convergence. What this means is that one way or another, the equalization formula is going to have to be discussed. The system will break down if Alberta, which has basically been funding most of it, if Alberta's fiscal capacity is no higher than that of the average of the rest of the country. So equalization is going to be up for change. How's that? Am I getting any amplification here? Yeah. Okay. So equalization is heading for renewal in one way or another. Legally, that can be done by a change in legislation or possibly even by federal order in council. But I think in practice, it's going to require some form of consultation with the provinces. And what Alberta has to worry about, be concerned about, is that they don't concoct a new formula which penalizes Alberta again. We have to be right in the mix there to protect our interests. Now, here's an interesting fact from recent developments in Quebec. Quebec has started what they call the Generations Fund. This is like the Alberta Heritage Fund. This is money that they're putting aside. And that means that their budget is balanced and they can afford to put surplus away in a kind of investment account. And it started before 2000. These are recent figures. It's getting quite large by projection. Now almost 9 billion, and that means next year going up to 11.5 billion, 14.5 billion. The projection is it will increase by $2.5 or $3 billion a year. When you look at the numbers, the increase in the Quebec Generations Fund is about the size of what Alberta contributes to equalization. So the current policy is taking away from Alberta roughly $2.5 billion a year, and which is the amount that Quebec is able to put away in a savings account. Now, I have to give Quebec credit for balancing their budget. I mean, I think that's a great thing. For a long time, Quebec was running deficits, but in recent years, they've turned it around, and I applaud that. But is it necessary to give a big subsidy to a province which is now able to simply take the money and put it away in savings? Good question. Okay, next one. So how does the provincial referendum figure in all of this? Well, during the campaign, Premier Kenney promised to hold a provincial referendum on equalization, quote, if there's no major progress on market opening pipelines. Now, I actually don't know whether there will be a referendum in the fall of this year. Some of you may have better intelligence on this than I have. There's been really no public discussion about it recently, and I've asked members of the legislature that I've talked to, and they don't know either what's actually coming. If he wants to avoid holding the referendum, he can point to the fact that TMX is under construction, that Line 3 is under construction. So he could argue that actually there has been some progress on pipelines, and maybe there won't be a referendum at all. I can't guarantee it, but we have this sort of promise. Now, if he wants to go through with it, it would be carried out under the Constitutional Referendum Act, which is a piece of provincial legislation. That act stipulates that the question has to be introduced by a minister into the Legislative Assembly, and the Assembly must approve the wording of the question. Now, here's a sample question. This is the recommendation of the Fair Deal panel. Do you support the removal of Section 36, establishing the principle of equalization from the Constitution Act 1982? I actually think that's probably the right question. Advance it, please. See, why do we have to refer to the question? Why can't we just say in the question, excuse me, why do we have to refer to the Constitution? We could why can't we ask the people, do you think equalization is a bad deal for Alberta? Or something like that. Well, the reason why the Constitution has to be involved is that it is the wording of a Supreme Court decision, the secession reference from what was it, 1980, 1998, I think, in which the court made up something, and they make up stuff all the time. Most of it is contrary to the interests of Alberta, but this time they happened to make up something that Alberta could use. The court was talking about mainly about a referendum on Quebec separation, Quebec independence. But en passant, it said the Constitution Act 1982 gives expression to this principle, and that principle is democratic discussion, by conferring a right to initiate constitutional change on each participant in Confederation, and that means on the provinces. In our view, the existence of this right imposes a corresponding duty on the participants in Confederation to engage in constitutional discussions in order to acknowledge and address democratic expressions of a desire for change in other provinces. This duty is inherent to the democratic principle, which is a fundamental predicate of our system of governance. And that comes from the reference re-secession of Quebec. So the legal context behind a referendum, what that requires is a resolution by the Legislative Assembly. But a referendum would give that political weight. So the process is to hold the referendum first, you win that, get the people of Alberta to say they want the Constitution amended, and then you bring Ottawa and other provinces in for discussion, and you hope that out of that, what you may not get a constitutional amendment out of that. Actually, it's not the constitutional amendment which would matter. It would be the equalization formula, which would reduce the burden on Alberta. That's really what the aim would be, is to reduce the fiscal burden on the taxpayers of Alberta. So this is a rather complicated means of getting there. Just asking probably wouldn't have any results, but if you can invoke a decision of the Supreme Court, you might be able to require other governments to come to discussion. Now, the Premier of Quebec has said more than once that he's embarrassed by equalization, even though, you know, even if you would disapprove of the policy, somebody sends you the money, you take it. Probably there are many people in the room who take payments from government of one form or another that they disapprove of in principle, but if they send you the check, you deposit it. So I think we would have some allies in the discussion, including, surprisingly, Quebec. We would see anyway. We would see if the Premier of Quebec actually means what he has said more than once about his opinion on equalization as an embarrassment to Quebec. So that's the legal thinking behind a referendum on equalization that could be held this fall. So I've gone into, you know, a fair amount of detail on it. It is a complex proposal, and it would be up, if the government goes ahead with it, it would be up to them to explain it to citizens in a political way, not my academic way, but in a more emotional political way, raise the temperature, get people worked up about it, get a yes vote, then pass a resolution in the Legislative Assembly calling upon other governments in Canada to come to the table, as they are required to do according to this Supreme Court decision. Why don't I stop there? Do we have time for any questions? It's been turned off. Question, anybody got a question?
Thank you, Mr. Flanagan. It's an excellent beginning. My apprehension, I guess, is the word I would use at this point, is that I can see and feel almost from here the heat being generated by the law firms that are rubbing their hands together to prosecute this case. As you know from my history, the federal legislation known as the Canadian Wheat Board proceeded for a number of years, and there was lots of people. In fact, if there were certain of us wouldn't have taken some initiative, I'll call it, those law firms would still be employed. So I was wondering, there's a process. I know there's a process going forward, but at some point, we have to revert possibly to what even Jason Kenney has described as a get her done attitude. And I just was wondering if you could give some hints as to how that may proceed in a different fashion. Thank you.
Do I have any volume here? Yeah, okay. Yes, there may be legal challenges to it. It's a common political strategy today to use a legal challenge. It can be done on many things. I think the legal basis for this is solid. There's a Supreme Court decision, and there's existing legislation in Alberta to authorize referendums on constitutional issues. So we'd have to wait and see what lawyers came up with, but I think this is solid. Going beyond the law, as you did when you took your wheat across, it would be easier if Alberta wrote the check to equalization, but then it could withhold it. But Alberta, as a government, doesn't write the check. The money comes from all the taxes that are collected. So I'm not sure how you would intervene to block the money going into equalization.
Sure, yeah. Yes. You're supposed to say, Mr. Speaker, can I? Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, and I know I've got 30 seconds. No, I got, I forget exactly the timing, and we ran over. Exactly to that idea, Mr. Flanagan. I appreciate that, because I've considered from personal experience an issue that stuck out in my mind when we were buying, our family was buying an $80,000 ag aircraft. And when I got the certified check for that from the bank lady, she said, well, are you aware whether or not there's a lien against that aircraft? And I said, well, no, we're not. She said, well, I can search that. And so in that case, we made the check out to the aircraft company and the Royal Bank of Canada. So could we send our federal tax money to the provincial treasurer and the federal treasurer, and therefore then put the pressure on Mr. Kenney to reissue those funds to Ottawa as he saw fit?
Well, I guess you're proposing a kind of a tax strike. It's attractive emotionally. Probably none of us enjoy paying that amount, but legally, I don't think it will fly.
Can I comment on that? Sure. Thank you, Rick. I think we're getting ahead of it a little bit. I mean, I think Jason has the right to have, I think as a province, we have the right to have a referendum. Like, we can have the referendum. What you're talking about is, what are we going to do after we've had the referendum and 95% of the people have said we want something done about it? You know what I mean? That's the question, is like, how do we go forward from there? But Jason's argument is we'll have the referendum, then we'll have the campaign to get people in Alberta to vote in favor of the referendum, so everybody's familiar with it. Josh Anderson, talks about this with this Project Confederation. He said, let's have the referendum, and then, but my fear is that we'll have the referendum, 95% of us will vote in favor of it. Jason Kenney will write a letter to the government saying we've had a referendum, 95% of the write a letter to the federal government, say we've had a referendum, 95% of Albertans want you to do something about it. And then, of course, they won't do anything about it in the next few months, just like they haven't in the last 105 years. And in the fall of 2022, then Jason will come to us and say, well, yeah, I can't believe it. I wrote them a really stern letter and they haven't responded to us. So if you'll re-elect me, day one, I'm sending them a registered letter telling them we're fed up. So, I mean, I think some of us are already there, as you can probably sense. But do we have another question? But Go ahead. You've got the mic. Oh, no, no. Does anybody have another question or a comment? Mate, I think we're entirely within our right to have the referendum. And so let's have the referendum, but let's try and get a few more things on the ballot.
Danny, but you're sliding over another step in there. It's not just the referendum result. That's just to give it some political heft. It would have to require a resolution in the Legislative Assembly.
Right. Okay.
So Jason wouldn't be just writing a letter. He would be getting something passed in the Legislative Assembly and communicating that in a formal way. And if other provinces, particularly the federal government, refuse to respond, it would then be possible to go to court and ask for an order of some form, because you have the Supreme Court decision to rely upon. So it's a little more than just writing a letter. I agree it is somewhat long and involved, and there's many possibilities for delay on the part of Ottawa or other provincial governments. So it's not something that's going to yield a result immediately. But since the equalization formula is getting close to crashing anyway, because of the what has happened to the Alberta economy, there's going to have to be some changes in it, one way or another. So I think we can feed into that. Yeah, but I agree, it's long and involved, and there's no guarantee of the immediate result.
The one thing I do agree with Jason on is, by having the referendum, hopefully he will get people involved. And again, to go back to this January of last year, when we had that Future of Alberta meeting in Edmonton, or in Calgary, there was a speaker there from Quebec, and he said when the referendum came along, sure, it was a long question, and people say, oh, the question has to be clear, but he said he was eagerly anticipating, or he was working on the let's leave side. He said he went to the polling station. It was supposed to close at 7. He said he got there at 6 o'clock, and he said his heart dropped because there was no one there. And so he went to the polling clerk and he said, what's going on? And she said, everyone in this constituency has already voted. He said, you know what I mean? So the point was, when people actually got the opportunity to vote one way or the other, they all informed themselves on it. And as long as the question was, as we heard yesterday, it was about a minute long, but everybody who came to vote knew it was yes or no. They didn't have to read the question. They were either voting yes or no. So it becomes clear in the minds of the voter the closer you get to voting time. So if there's any more questions, we can put them up on the screen. And I think she's just holding the mic looking for somebody to ask a question. But if there's no more questions, we can actually put our questions up on the screen, and we've got quite a bit of time for questions. Do you want to comment on this or anything, Paul, or do you think we're good to go for the time being? Okay, let's call that good for right now. Thank you very much.